Welcome to People Places Planet Pod, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working to ensure a healthy environment, prosperous economies, and vibrant communities founded on the rule of law.
Welcome to today's podcast. I'm Linda Breggin. I'm a senior attorney with the Environmental Law Institute and also a lecturer in law at Vanderbilt University Law School, where we are recording this podcast today. We are delighted to have Tatiana Schlossberg with us here today to discuss her book, Inconspicuous Consumption, the environmental impact you don't know you have. And yes, even a veteran environmental lawyer like myself learned a lot from this book. And not to be a spoiler, but I do not feel as happy in my yoga athleisure wear, my cashmere cardigan sweater, or binge watching Netflix now that I have read Tatiana's book. But what is so compelling about her book is that it takes a lot of really complicated data about the environmental impact we all have, whether it's fashion or food or travel or shopping or internet use. And she summarizes that data in a really accessible manner, including some really sticky facts that you'll remember and talk about with your friends. But I think the most important thing is that she somehow does this with a sense of humor. You actually smile at times as you read this book, and it's actually entertaining, even though the topic is hardly comical. And I really appreciate that because it's easy to despair at times when we consider how we degrade our environment. And Tatiana recognizes this, but reminds us that this is a natural reaction and that we still need to move forward. She helps us understand how all of our environmental impacts fit together and that we need to keep track of the big picture. So by way of background, Tatiana is a journalist who writes about climate change and the environment. She previously reported on these subjects for the science and climate sections of the New York Times, where she also worked on the Metro desk. Her work has appeared in many prestigious outlets, including The Atlantic, the Boston Globe, Bloomberg, and Yale Environment 360. She is a graduate of Yale and has a master's degree from Oxford. Before we jump into our discussion, I want to introduce two people here with us today who will pose some questions to Tatiana about her book. First is Ann Davis. Ann is an environmental lawyer and advocate and the former managing attorney for the Southern Environmental Law Center's office here in Nashville. Also with us today is Elizabeth Holden, a third-year law student at Vanderbilt University Law School, who already has an impressive resume as editor-in-chief of the Environmental Law and Policy Annual Review and was the moot court champion last year. And I hope she'll bring her generation's perspective to this discussion. So I'd like to start by welcoming you, Tatiana, and asking you, why did you decide to write this book, Inconspicuous Consumption?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I wanted to write this book because I felt that, when I became a climate and environment reporter, that there was so much missing from this conversation that might make it relevant to people who didn't think that they were already interested or cared about it. And, I think part of that was a problem of scale. On the one hand, we talk about plastic straws, and on the other hand, we talk about a complete transformation of the electricity grid in less than 10 years. And so I thought that there might be something in between those two things that would make this issue, relevant to readers in the scale and context of their own lives. And so that's why I wanted to write this book, which is about a lot of our stuff. And so I wrote about the internet, food, fashion, and fuel, and how the impacts of a few things in each of those areas connect us all to each other through their impacts and connect us to global climate change and environmental degradation in other parts of the world. And so, but I thought that having an entry point, which was kind of the fabric and material of our daily lives, might help people to kind of see themselves in this problem without making them feel like they were personally responsible for it.
Well, you did a great job with that. It really is. It's a great read. I'm going to hand it over to Ann Davis to ask a few questions.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Tatiana, for being here. I'm curious, what sparked your interest in the environment? Is that something you've always cared about, or was there a certain something that happened at some point that made you really be as passionate about it as you are now?
Well, I think, like a lot of people in my generation, I saw an inconvenient truth when I was in high school, and it kind of stuck with me. I mean, I didn't do anything about it, but I thought about it, or kind of made an issue that I had learned about in school in a very abstract way feel really kind of real and urgent. And then when I was working as a municipal reporter in New Jersey, I was covering a bunch of towns there during Hurricane Sandy, and that was, I think, a pretty powerful example to me of how different people certainly some people were hit harder than others, but no matter where people lived or their income bracket or their race, everybody was dealing with this problem, whether it was big cities or trailer parks or rural areas, and so I kind of really saw how communities responded to that, and how New York City is still repairing the subway, and it's 8 years later. So and then when I was in graduate school, I read a lot of environmental history, which I really loved, and kind of put climate change into a historical context for me, and made me sort of realize and understand that as much as climate change is unprecedented in many ways, we've been dealing with versions of it for as long as people have been extracting resources from our environment, and to kind of understand it with that long view was really interesting for me, and made me kind of kept it at the back of my head. But when I was at the New York Times, I was writing a morning column where I had to wake up. I started work at 4 a.m. every day, and I didn't want to do that anymore. So, and at the time, there were 4 people covering climate change at the New York Times. They were all kind of middle-aged guys, and I felt like that I might be able to add a different perspective to that, and I also felt climate change is the biggest story in the world, and it's a story about everything. And so from that perspective, from a journalistic perspective, it felt like a story that I really wanted to be a part of telling, and that hopefully I could do it in a different way than had been done, because it is incredibly interesting and compelling and dramatic and urgent. And people at the time when I started, which was 4 years ago, people didn't care nearly as much as they do now, which is still not enough. So I was very lucky to get to do that.
Well, you really did take ownership of it for your generation, and it was very interesting to me, the 4 topics that you picked out to discuss. And could you talk a little bit about why you picked these 4 topics, and then I'd like to go into a little more depth on each of them.
Okay. So I wrote the 4 topics in the book are the internet and technology, food, fashion, and fuel. And fuel is kind of a grab bag. It has a little energy and a little transportation. So that and food, that's like 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. So I figured I kind of had to write about those things. And then, but they're also incredibly interesting. And I thought that I could cover them, particularly fuel, in a way that hadn't been done before. And, writing about things like wood pellets and biomass and air conditioning. I think we often just hear about like wind and solar and natural gas, and not sort of the broader spectrum of our energy system. And then food, a lot of people have heard about food, and it's kind of that I think is one of the areas that people are most aware of, but it seemed, again, like I couldn't leave it out. And then the internet and technology and fashion, I think, were 2 areas where the environmental impact is not necessarily intuitive or obvious, particularly the internet. And I think part of that is because of the way that we talk about it. We talk about like the cloud, and we carry around our phones in our pockets, but it really is this big physical system that's switched on and using electricity all the time. So kind of illuminating that, and illuminating the impact of producing all of our devices, which requires mining and shipping and labor and different rare materials all over the world, and what happens to those materials when we're done with them, was, I think, a really underreported story. And for fashion was actually, I think there's been a greater interest in the last 6 months, but it was actually really hard to write about because there was very little information. And so for that, I had to kind of pick a few materials and write about their various impacts. But, I think those are the kinds of things that really bring this issue to our own lives, because we, particularly our clothing, it feels so intimate, and it feels like something that just belongs to us, but it really is connected to the global supply chain. And it shouldn't be surprising, even though it was to me, because, textiles were what fueled the Industrial Revolution and have kind of always been a big part of global trade. But For some reason, it didn't always feel that way. But I think it's really important for me to emphasize that, yes, this book is about all of our stuff and our personal habits in some ways, but it really is not about trying to make anyone feel guilty for the things that they do, or to suggest that this is a problem that can be fixed only by changing your individual personal behavior, because it's much bigger than that. And I think that the narrative of personal responsibility has been destructive in some ways, because I think it makes us turn away from the problem. So I don't think we should feel individually guilty for climate change, but I think we should feel collectively responsible for building a better world.
Well, I think he definitely made me feel like not personally responsible, but more collectively, like we're all in this. Mm-hmm. We've all got impacts. And especially following up on Linda's comment, I was shocked to find that the athleisure that I am caught wearing most days now has a really bad impact on the environment. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So athleisure primarily is made from synthetic fabrics, which are made from oil, which is also kind of crazy when you think about it. But producing polyester is, I think, I may get the number wrong, but I think it's like the equivalent of, or results in emissions of like 140 million tons of carbon dioxide every year. And that's just polyester, which is that's the most common synthetic fiber, but we still use a lot of others. So it uses a lot of oil and resources and energy to produce this stuff. But kind of the more insidious problem is that since our clothes are made of plastic, they kind of, when we put them in the washing machine, they spin off little pieces of fiber, which are too small to be caught by the water filter in our washing machines, and so they can end up in our wastewater systems. And if they're not caught by the wastewater treatment plants, they can end up in the ocean. And if they settle into the sludge in wastewater treatment plants, that's often used as fertilizer for agricultural fields, and so they can get into our water system or our food system that way. So I think, this was something that I had heard of, but there's been a ton of fixation on the ocean plastic problem, but really none on this issue. And people are finding these plastic fibers everywhere, whether it's, the deepest part of the ocean, but also Himalayan glaciers, freshwater lakes everywhere. So it really is kind of this massive pollution problem. And some scientists think that, microfiber plastic pollution is the most abundant form of pollution on Earth. So that was kind of really staggering, because I feel like it is definitely within my lifetime, maybe within the last 10 years, that everyone is just wearing exercise clothes all the time. So,
which in some ways is a great development.
Yes, very comfortable, wicks your sweat. But at the same time, I think it's really easy for us to kind of just enjoy the convenience and not look much farther than that.
And it's not just the exercise clothes, but it's the fleece vest and the fleece jackets, right?
Yeah. It's anything that's made of synthetic fibers, but fleece, you're right, fleece sheds the most. It can shed up to 100,000 fibers with a single wash, and which is kind of, and Patagonia sponsored a big study, I think the University of Santa Barbara, on this issue. And, they had created these plastic fleeces as a way to figure out what to do with leftover plastic bottles, and to make something new from them, and then it creates this additional problem. So it's I think a good example of no good deed goes unpunished, but also that using all of the resources that we do, particularly fossil fuels, those don't go away, and they're they end up in in our environment in other ways, whether that's plastic pollution or emissions or something else.
So moving from fashion to energy, you took a very interesting perspective on energy, because you talked about a topic a lot of people don't know about, which is coal ash, and something that's how you and I met when you were covering a story about coal ash. So could you talk a little bit about the problem of coal and the problem of coal ash that a lot of people don't see?
Yeah, so Well, reporting the story on coal ash, which is what brought me to Nashville, and when I met Anne and some of the other lawyers from the Southern Environmental Law Center, I wouldn't say it changed my life, but it changed my life because like Anne said, most people don't know about it, and once I learned about it, I couldn't believe that not everybody knows about it and that we don't talk about it all the time. And it really has been a really kind of motivating issue for me, and one that I hope that more people understand. So coal ash is the byproduct of burning coal for electricity. And I think when we think about coal or talk about coal, maybe we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, or we know about mining and some of the impacts of that, but we don't really think about what happens to coal when it's burned. And it creates this, it can't be burned entirely. So there's a lot of residue left over, which used to be kind of just puffed out of the stacks of power plants, but you can't do that anymore. So now it's usually flushed out of power plants in water and then stored in sort of dammed off sections of rivers and lakes near power plants. It's one of the largest solid industrial waste streams in the U.S. We produce more than 100 million tons of it every year in almost every single state. It contains mercury, lead, arsenic, cadmium, selenium, strontium. Tell me if I'm forgetting any. But all these different substances that can be hazardous to human health, and it can seep into the groundwater from where it's stored, even though it's not supposed to, or escape into the air, depending on how it's stored. And it disproportionately, those pollutants can cause a range of diseases from, cancer to other lung problems, or low birth weight, I think, and other things. But it disproportionately impacts communities of color, low-income communities, and rural communities, who suffer from this pollution. And, I grew up in New York. We don't have a coal-fired power plant in the city, so I never had to think about coal ash, and that's such a luxury to not have to know what it is. And there are millions of Americans who do, and have to live with the effects every day. And realizing that that we can be so separated from the consequences of our actions, like turning on the light bulb, but that somebody somewhere else is suffering from that, was a really kind of made it very clear to me how we are all implicated in these systems and all connected to them. And learning about your work and the work of the Southern Environmental Law Center, and kind of what you were all doing to make sure that people were protected from these dangerous substances that they can't even see or don't even know about, was so powerful and important to me.
Talking about energy usage, you've got one suggestion in your book that is something that I know I should do it, and I think about it from time to time, but it's something everyone can do, and that is pay attention to what energy your devices are using when you're not using them, right?
Yeah. I have a chapter on vampire power, which is, the devices the power that your devices use when you think that they're off. So, I tested a lot of my appliances and appliances of friends, which people didn't love, but when you go over to their house and unplug all of their stuff. But it's like my cable box, which was, I wasn't watching TV, but it was, drawing in more power than somebody in Haiti uses in a year. So it's kind of incredible. And, I forget about it too, but I did remember recently I went away and I turned off my cable and my router before I left. So, but it's not that, if you don't do those things, that means you're a bad person or an industrial polluter, but just that, this use of energy and resources can be so unconscious, but it can be meaningful, over the long term.
And I love the title of your book, Inconspicuous Consumption, because all these impacts that you talk about are really because of our habit of just consuming without thinking about it, right?
Yeah, and I think that, that's been drilled into us, that like that's kind of how our economy works, and this kind of scalability and growth is really kind of what has defined success. But I think, we have not, as a global society, been able to decouple growth in GDP from growth in greenhouse gas emissions. And so, I think at some point we're going to have to re-examine sort of what it means to grow and what it means to succeed, and and how to do both of those things responsibly.
The last topic you talk about is food, and that's kind of food production and food waste. And will you tell us a little bit about what the problems are with the way we interact with food?
Where to begin? I think some of the things that people have heard are actually true, which is, like eating red meat uses a lot of energy and resources, and that's not, and produces a lot of emissions, and that's not just from like the cows themselves, but sort of how we feed them, and we primarily feed them corn and soybeans, and corn in particular requires a ton of fertilizer use. And I think people are sort of familiar with the idea that corn is sort of in everything we eat, from reading Michael Pollan's book, and there's some awareness of that. But I think like the fact that so much fertilizer is used there's enough corn grown in the Midwest to actively change the climate is pretty incredible. But that we use so much fertilizer that we're kind of killing freshwater systems and the Gulf of Mexico for corn that doesn't even need to be produced, because we produce so much of it, and so much is used in ethanol. And so I think the incentives are really off in our food system, because farmers can be given government subsidies to grow corn, which is then put in our gasoline, which we don't necessarily need. It's not cleaner, so everything is kind of out of whack. But I think so, and people may be familiar with that, and familiar with issues around food waste, and how, and I know Linda is doing a lot of work on that, but that we waste about 30 to 40% of the food that we produce, which is so upsetting, to think about how lucky we are that most people have enough to eat, and we're willing to throw it away. But I really wanted to write about the oceans and somewhere in the book, and so I was able to do that in this section by writing about fish, both how climate change is impacting the oceans, particularly in terms of ocean acidification, but also warming temperatures, and then also from aquaculture, which is fish farming, and I think like 20 million people depend on the ocean. No, 20% of the global population depends on the ocean for food. It's their primary source of protein, and we're conducting a major science experiment in the ocean by just pumping CO2 in there and seeing what happens. And and I think most scientists say that that's one of the outcomes of global warming that they're most concerned about. And I think most people don't know anything about ocean acidification, so I was glad to get a chance to write about it in the book.
And your book is available in bookstores, and also you've got an audio version, right?
I do, and I read it myself. So if you like what you hear today,
there's lots more. Well, Anne, thanks for all those really thought-provoking questions, and Tatiana, thank you again for sitting here with us today. I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth Holden to ask a few more questions, maybe from a little bit of a different perspective, because she is a current law student here at Vanderbilt.
So your research looks at systemic issues and how dispersed human behaviors are interconnected with their impact on the environment. But meanwhile, consumers are increasingly interested in sustainable products, and some, particularly in our generation, have gone as far as to embrace a zero-waste lifestyle. You alluded to this already a little bit, but I'm curious how you see the systemic issues you note in your book fitting with individual efforts.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's a tricky line to walk in the book between emphasizing that this is a problem that needs to be addressed on a governmental and corporate scale for the most part, while also connecting it to individual lives. And so I think that individual behavioral changes are important in that they're a place to start, but I think that it can't end there. There are not enough people doing enough to have the kind of impact on emissions reduction or reducing waste that we need to substantively address this problem. But I also, I don't want to make anyone think that it doesn't matter to, that we should just then therefore use as much plastic as we want and, stuff our faces with hamburgers and sundaes, but, which, from time to time. So I do think that's really important, but I don't want people to kind of lose sight of the larger issues, because I think it's really easy to get totally wrapped up in trying to figure out how to make the sustainable choice, and making the sustainable choice is often impossible because of the system that we live in. And I think too much responsibility has been placed on the consumer to make the sustainable choice, when usually we don't have enough information to know if, this pair of jeans is better than that pair of jeans. And really that should be addressed at the corporate level, either through their voluntary reductions, or kind of industry standards, or government regulations. And, because, for example, with light bulbs, although that has recently been changed, if you eliminate incandescent bulbs from the market, it's not up to the consumer then to decide whether to buy the kind of very efficient LED bulb or the energy intensive incandescent bulb. All of the bulbs are more efficient. And so I think kind of eliminating that choice
is helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say my family and friends are tired of me grilling the wait person at the restaurant about whether the swordfish came from the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean and how was it caught. And of course they don't have any idea, but I still have my fish card from the Monterey Bay Aquarium and I want to make a sustainable choice, but the information isn't there.
Yeah. So I think, so I don't want people to feel like if they can't make the sustainable choice, therefore they give up. And I do think, we can't all do everything, but you can pick something that you care about and do that, and then also remember that voting is kind of the single most important individual action that anyone can take, and voting for politicians who have advocate for climate action, and not only climate action but pollution regulations and things that are so important that people don't often think has anything to do with their own lives. So, but so I want people to do what they can, but I also don't want anyone to feel like they're failing if they don't do exactly what they think they're supposed to, because I think if we only think about ourselves and the impacts of our personal actions, we let those who are really responsible off the hook, and that's fossil fuel companies and lobbyists and the politicians who protect them. So,
and at the same time, individual actions, even if you are only doing a few things in aggregate, do add up.
Yeah.
So it is a balance, as you're saying.
Thank you. That was a very thoughtful answer. And so my last question is just that in your time reporting, ending on a positive note, what has been the most encouraging news that you encountered relating to climate mitigation and adaptation?
Well, it's kind of related to what we were just talking about, but I wrote about this village in England that, and I guess I wrote the story in 2017. So in 2007, they had just decided, on their own, that they were going to try to be the first carbon neutral village in England. And, they refused to take any help from anyone in government, and they wouldn't let any politicians come talk to them because they didn't want it to be a partisan issue. And they just sort of, everyone in the town kind of, they took a carbon footprint of their town, and everyone kind of did what they could to try to reduce it. And 10 years later, which is when I wrote about them, they weren't carbon neutral at all, but everyone in the village was aware of the effort and of trying to kind of rein in their emissions and their waste. And most people had stopped kind of traveling for work, and they were doing telecommuting, and a lot of people had gotten rid of dryers and things like that. So it was really kind of nice in a communal way to see that people, that it was possible to kind of work together to achieve something, and that it didn't have to be, I think, what we often see in this country, which is acrimonious and political, and some kind of moral stance, rather than well, let's just see what we can do to try. And I think that just even in my time reporting on this, which it's been 4 years, in the last year has changed dramatically. And I think the interest that people have shown, the school strike for climate, the level of attention that it's receiving in the Democratic primary. I mean, some people might say a 7-hour climate town hall is too much, but I think that level of interest and concern is really is exciting, and I hope that we're able to keep that momentum going.
So, and I just want to congratulate you for your work in bringing awareness to this. And, we talked a little bit about coal ash and how most people didn't know about it, but the way we met is when you did an excellent in-depth article for the New York Times about coal ash and what it was doing on southern rivers, basically, and covered our trial against TVA, who has been polluting with coal ash for years. So your reporting has brought a lot of awareness to all these issues, and your book brings even more. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it really does. Well, this has been a wonderful discussion, and I'd like to wrap up with one last question, because you touched on a lot of this in the discussion, but just as a nice sort of summary takeaway for listeners, what do you most hope people will do after they read your book? And I have to add the caveat, does that change at all depending on whether the same president is elected in November, which will make systemic change much harder?
The most important things that anybody can do, is to vote, again, as I mentioned before, and to get involved in the political process. And, whether that's kind of volunteering for a candidate or for an organization, an environmental group or nonprofit, something like that. But, again, because this issue does have to be addressed on a governmental, regulatory, corporate level, that's sort of where we need action to happen. So voting is the most important thing. The other most important thing to do is, we don't have to support companies that don't at the very least tell us about their practices. And, again, it is really hard to get that information sometimes, but there are ways to do it. I mean, for fashion, there's an app that's called Good On You, which does a lot of rating for different brands. But again, like, transparency is kind of the baseline. And if people aren't being transparent, then, we don't have to support them. And again, we don't have to keep electing politicians who also are not transparent about what their policies are or where their money comes from. And the third most important thing, I think, is to talk about climate change. I think, and the environment. I think for people who are listening to this podcast probably, and for all of us, we talk about it or think about it all the time, but only about a third of Americans say that they talk about climate change with their friends and family at all. But once they do, they're more likely to to consider it a risk and to support policies to mitigate it. And so I think talking about climate change and listening to other people's concerns is really important, because we do need everybody. If the president is reelected and the Senate doesn't change, I don't know. It's hard, and we don't have that kind of time. But if that does happen, I hope that we see kind of even more leadership on the state and local level, which we're seeing a lot of, and maybe from corporations as well. And Jeff Bezos just announced that he was going to give $10 billion to climate change research. If I were him, I would give $10 billion to electing a different president and Senate. But I think those kinds of things are important, and addressing there are lots of different ways to address this problem, and lots of different ways to care about it. And so I hope that people read the book, that they continue to think about this problem in their lives.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, Tatiana, and also to Ann Davis and Elizabeth Holden. There's more information about Tatiana's timely and compelling book at tatianaschlossberg.com. The book is an easy read, but it is incredibly informative. And to listen to more Environmental Law Institute podcasts on a wide range of environmental topics, please check out eli.org/podcasts. Thank you so much for listening today, and please share this podcast with your friends.
Thank you for tuning in to People, Places, Planet Pod, brought to you by the Environmental Law Institute. We would like to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and ideas to podcast@eli.org. And if you're interested in learning more about our work, attending one of our events, reading our publication, or becoming a member, please visit our website at www.eli.org.